Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today. I heard jumping jacks were in order, but I don't know if that makes me more tired or more alert. So yeah, can't really recommend that. But as Mish mentioned, my name's Claire, and I run a software company called Know Your Team, and we help managers become better leaders. And I've spent the past almost 10 years studying, researching, writing, and speaking about how managers become better leaders, first in running my own consulting practice, helping CEOs all over the world, and then most recently for the past 5 years, running Know Your Team, where we work with over 15,000 managers and employees at companies like Airbnb and Kickstarter. Today, though, the question that I'd love to ask all of you is, who's the worst boss you've ever had? And no need to say the person's name out loud. You can think this to yourself. But as you think through, perhaps maybe there's a few in competition for this title. Maybe it's someone who you worked for a few years ago. Maybe it's your current boss. But whoever that person is, who this worst boss is, I have no doubt that this person has been formative to perhaps how you lead and has maybe affected your leadership style, or maybe they're the reason you left your last job. But what we often don't think about when it comes to who this worst boss is, could it be us? Could we, in fact, unintentionally, be someone's worst manager? Let me explain. So Gallup every single year does a big study that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's the Q12 assessment, and they survey millions of employees and managers, actually over 84,000 business units this past year. And one of the findings that they revealed is that 82% of the time, companies actually choose the wrong manager. That companies actually identify individuals' skills as being indicators of success and thinking that that'll transfer over for leaders. And as many of us know, that isn't always the case. And so 82% of the time, they're actually promoting and choosing the wrong folks into these roles. In the same study with 1.8 million managers, Gallup found that 1 in 10 managers possess what they call the talent to manage. So they identified 5 attributes of what is often seen as the natural talent that leaders possess, whether it's around motivation, authority, and decision-making. And they found that folks just don't really seem to be naturally inclined out of the gate. It doesn't mean you can't develop this talent, but it means that naturally to have these skills that high-performing leaders have, only 1 in 10 people have this. So the probability that we in this room, myself included, might be in that 90% is quite high. And as uncomfortable as it may be to think about, and trust me, in many ways this talk is a little bit autobiographical, is that we in fact might just be someone's worst boss. And what I want to talk about today is how to avoid this. What can we do to make sure we don't accidentally become a bad boss? And I'll pull from the data that we've collected through Know Your Team over the past 5 years, surveying over 15,000 people in 25 countries, and share what the biggest mistakes have been for leaders that all of us in this room can avoid. The first of these mistakes is around trust. So, for many of us, trust seems pretty intuitive. It's about building trust, right? It's about team building, rather. That's what trust is about. So this means social events, team building activities, company retreats. This means thanking your team members, showing recognition, saying when people are doing a good job. This means being transparent with company information, right? Isn't this what trust is about? Interestingly enough, we surveyed almost 600 managers this past fall about what they found to be the most effective ways to build trust. And each of these 3 elements actually ranked in the lowest in terms of the most effective ways to build trust. For these almost 600 people who were a part of mostly actually the tech industry, they didn't seem to think that actually sharing company information was really about building trust. They didn't really seem to think that thanking team members helped to build trust. And for me, this was a fascinating realization because of how much time and energy I know I personally spend in thinking about each of these things. And it's not to say you shouldn't do them, but when it comes to building trust, they're just not necessarily the most effective means. So what is the most effective way to build trust? Well, according to this survey that we did with almost 600 people, we found that the most effective way to build trust is to simply show vulnerability. It's to admit your mistakes as a leader. It's to say when you're wrong. The second most effective way to build trust is to make your intentions clear, to simply say when you feel or why you feel you're doing something and when you change your mind about it. The third most effective way to build trust is to follow through on your commitments, to do what you say you're going to do. And some of you, might be smiling, looking at these slides like, oh yeah, these things do build trust. But the beauty of this is that none of these things, revealing what you're weak at, revealing what your intentions are, and actually just following through on what you say you're going to do. None of these things require money. They don't require bringing in any fancy consultant. All of these things you can actually start doing more of tomorrow if you want to be building trust. So what trust really comes down to is our intention matching our behavior. Trust is not, in fact, about team building. And if we can avoid this conception in our heads, we can avoid this mistake that so many leaders make about what trust really is. The second biggest mistake that leaders often make is around feedback. Oh man, how many of us get feedback all the time? One-on-ones, peer reviews, 360 reviews, performance reviews. I know I personally, as a CEO, feel inundated with feedback. I mean, both from customers and from the team. It's easy to think that we have enough feedback. It's good. Well, what's interesting is I'd like for you to consider how often the following phrases you hear from your team. There's an area outside my current role that I feel like I could be contributing. How often would you say that someone comes up to you and says this to you during a one-on-one? Well, we found through Know Your Team, people think this 76% of the time. And this surprised me because I know in my own company, I don't feel like people are saying this 76% of the time. How about this phrase? Something is holding me back from doing my best work right now. How often do people say this to you in your own team? Well, through Know Your Team, we found that almost 60% of people believe that there's something actually holding them back from doing their best work right now. And yet we don't hear it that often. And then lastly, how often do we hear this phrase? I think we're behind the curve on something in particular. As a CEO, that's something I'd like to hear, yet, how often do I hear that? Well, through Know Your Team, we found that people actually believe this 65% of the time. They think that there's something that the team is behind the curve in, and yet we do not hear this 65% of the time. So clearly, we don't have enough feedback at all. There's so much that we don't know. And in terms of unearthing this information, okay, well, how do we do it? Well, there's a simple answer. One-on-one meetings, yes, and it's been talked about a lot today. I think one of the speakers earlier said that, it doesn't scale, and it doesn't. But here's the interesting thing about one-on-ones. While they may not scale, they're the most effective means of unearthing this kind of in-depth, actionable feedback that is typically so hard to get. So the question really is, well, how do I make sure that my one-on-ones aren't just becoming monotonous, that I'm not just scheduling them for the sake of scheduling them? How am I making sure I'm getting the most out of these one-on-one meetings so that I can get this kind of feedback that I know I'm not getting enough of? Well, the first and foremost, and a few folks throughout the day have mentioned this, which I've been so happy to hear, is to not make your one-on-one meetings a status update. You can do that in Slack, you can do that in an email update, you can do that in a separate meeting, but a one-on-one meeting is a sacred time for you and your direct report to actually uncover these issues. So make sure that you don't spend this time just getting caught up on what's been going on. The second way that you can make the most out of a one-on-one meeting is to make sure that you're on the same page with your direct report about what you want to talk about. So maybe ahead of time, co-write the agenda together, send a few points, ask for feedback, and make sure that you're both going into the meeting with shared expectations for the things you want to get out of it. And then lastly, you're not going to be able to get the kind of feedback you want from your employees, from your direct reports, if you're not asking specific questions. And the more specific, the better. If you ask, how's it going? What are most people going to say? Fine. Right? And so if you want to know, are we behind the curve on something? Ask them that. If you want to know, oh, is there an area outside your current role you feel like you could be contributing? Ask them that. The more specific these questions are, the better, because you're never getting enough of this feedback. So make sure you avoid this mistake of thinking so. The third biggest mistake that managers often make is around their conception of time. We are busy, aren't we? And oftentimes, when we are so busy, day to day, in the ins and outs of everything, it can be easy to think that being this busy is good. We're getting stuff done, we're knocking things out, we're making things happen. This is good, right? I recently interviewed Michael Lopp, who is the VP of Engineering at Slack, and some of you may follow his work on leadership and his writing on leadership. And he shared with me an insight that he repeatedly emphasized throughout our interview. He said, Claire, if you're too busy doing the actual work as a manager, that's a huge mistake. When you're busy making it happen, knocking things out, you don't have time to think about if there are morale issues in the team. You don't have time to resolve a conflict between two members. You're too busy. And you are essentially avoiding what the most important thing is, which is to help your team achieve the work. And you cannot do that if you are in the work itself. So if we shouldn't be busy actually doing the work, which admittedly is so easy to get dragged into, what are we supposed to be really focused on doing as leaders? In Know Your Team, we actually have an online community of more than 1,000 managers from all over the world, and we asked them this question: what should a leader be spending their time on the most? Here's what they said. So over 1,000 managers weighed in, and they said that one of the biggest things that a manager should be spending their time on is recruiting and hiring. Who is actually on your team is going to affect where your team's going to go and how fast you're going to get there. The second thing a manager and leader should be thinking about and spending their time on is long-term vision and culture. This is what the community of managers were saying. There's really no one else in the organization who's going to be thinking about this for your team, so if you're not doing this yourself, then who is? And then lastly, what they said is that a manager and leader should be spending their time communicating the direction of the team at all times. And when you're too busy in the weeds of the work, fixing mistakes, finishing up projects, thinking, oh, no one else can do it quite just like me, so I'm just going to get in there and fix this. If you're too busy doing that, then you're not going to have time to do those three things. After all, the best leaders, they're choosing not to be busy. They're choosing instead to think, you know what, if I'm busy, that's actually not good. So make sure you don't make this fatal mistake as well. Now, some of you, as I was going through these slides, may be thinking, oh yeah, those mistakes are familiar. Thank you, Claire. These are good reminders. I've made some of them before, but I'm good now. I don't make these anymore. I'd like to challenge you. I'd like to remind you of that statistic that 82% of us in this room weren't actually chosen in the right way to be here, unfortunately, myself included. I'd like to remind you that only 1 in 10 people possess the so-called natural talent to manage. This is hard. And admitting that this is hard might in fact be the greatest thing that we can do to get over accidentally becoming a bad manager. So my challenge to all of you today is to relook at each of these mistakes and ask yourself, which ones am I accidentally making? Which of these mistakes am I making on occasion, or when I'm stressed, or when I'm just not conscious of the different trade-offs? Is it that I'm getting too fixated on the fact that trust is about team building, and I'm just thinking that trust is going to happen in my team if I'm throwing events and if I'm just sharing information? Is it that, I actually think that I'm not utilizing my one-on-one meetings to be at their fullest potential, and am I making that wrong assumption that I'm already getting enough feedback? Or is the mistake that I'm making is that I think I'm doing a good job just because I'm busy? And do I need to rethink how I'm actually spending my time day to day as a manager? The minute that you can take stock of which of these mistakes you might accidentally be making, or even better, affirm the fact that, I'm not making maybe any of these, at least at the moment. That's how we'll all progress in making sure that we don't accidentally become that worst boss that we never wanted to work for. So my hope today in this presentation was just to be as helpful to you as possible. So if there is a specific situation that you feel like, you know what, Claire, I think I'm making a mistake here, but I'm not really sure what else to do. This is my personal email address. Please shoot me a note, or also in the question section, ask me whatever you'd like. And then if you'd love to learn more about how you can actually automate some of these best practices that I've shared, I'd love for you to check out Know Your Team. As I mentioned, it's a software tool that helps managers become better. And we actually never usually do this, but we have a special discount just for SF ELC members. So you can definitely check it out, and that's the URL there. And I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So we actually have 2 questions today. We'll finish these 2 because we're close to 5, and I think everyone's looking forward to cocktails and dinner. Do you engage in discussing personal topics during your one-on-ones?
Definitely. So, and of course, personal, what that means by definition, I think, varies according to the situation and such, so you can sort of use your best judgment. But the sort of purpose of a one-on-one, as I mentioned, is to typically uncover issues that you may not usually know of. Now, there are 4 categories of that, though. That could be to uncover specific issues, that could be to talk about career growth, that could be about feedback, and then the last is actually about personal connection. So to have a period of time either within that one-on-one or to actually dedicate an entire one-on-one just to establishing that personal rapport is definitely something that you can do. We ran a survey with almost 2,000 managers just on one-on-one meetings, and I want to say that personal connection and talking about personal topics ranked, I think, 3rd in terms of the topics. Number 1, again, being uncovering issues.
Awesome. So the next question is, what is the best one-on-one length and cadence?
Great question. So again, caveat, every organization is different. It's going to vary based on team size, if you're remote, all of that. But what we found in our survey that we did with almost 2,000 managers is that the most common frequency for one-on-ones is actually every single week. And the average team size for managers who answered this was under, I believe, was between 5 to 7 people. So 5 to 7 people once a week. And then the most common length was 1 hour. And then we asked folks, okay, does that seem too long or too little for the employees who answered the survey? Again, almost 2,000 people. And they actually said it was just right. So 30 minutes typically is a little too short. An hour and a half, again, this is totally context dependent. Usually a little too long. So by default, though, every week with teams, about 5 to 7 people for an hour.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And please join me in thanking Claire for her time and her talk.
Thank you.